Thank you so much. I will admit there was a little confusion. I thought I was giving the same talk that I gave in the fall, and I found out 2 days ago that I'm actually supposed to perform. So we're going to do a little bit of an adjustment because I haven't really had time to figure stuff out. So I'll be giving some of my presentation, and then I'll see if I can adapt some things with my cello and the piano. So nothing like going off the seat of your pants during Holy Week. So it's a little exciting, but I'm very happy to be here with your group in New Jersey. I grew up in Connecticut, so just very, very close by, which is a lot of fun. We're going to start a little bit with just what makes adaptations unique for music with Jane Austen. And then I'll play mostly stuff from Pride and Prejudice, both the 95 and the 2005 version, because I think that they both help see how you can tell a story. The music usually has a couple of different functions in general in any movie. And one of those is usually to set the mood and guide your emotions. And the other place, especially with adaptations, is sometimes it likes to give you a setting. So are we in a period drama or not? That is often up to the director or and the composer together. And so some of that is very clear in Jane Austen, and others decide to go completely a different direction, which is very interesting. One thing that's very important for Jane Austen is that music is key to the plot. So you need to have it in your dancing. You know, you're going to have a ball, so you have to have music. And the majority of adaptations choose to use music that's already traditionally been used for a couple centuries. Mr. Beveridge's Maggot has been around since the 1500s, and that's used in 2 different adaptations. So they use music that maybe not be 100% Regency accurate, but is things that they'd be familiar with. There are 2 exceptions, because there's 3 exceptions. There's always exceptions. Sense and Sensibility, actually, Patrick Doyle always writes his own music. Doesn't matter whether it's Cinderella or the songs from Shakespeare, he always writes his music for songs and for dances. And even though he sets it in a kind of Mozart style, he is also writing them very much in the, that's very unique to his own music. So I'm gonna play a little bit actually of, because he wrote both the music and the songs. And I don't have the dance music, but I do have the my father's favorite. And that always helps us set 2 things. One is this is a song that is important for Marianne. It tells you a lot about Marianne. And then the other thing is it is also setting up imitating some classical music. So I might need to raise the piano lid for a second. And I do apologize, my piano is out of tune. So I do apologize to any musicians who are slightly bothered by that. That's actually my father's favorite, which is used particularly for Eleanor. That is kind of her theme throughout. And one thing that it does, which is very, very consistent with the classical period, is something which we call the Alberti bass, which is named after somebody who, he didn't come up with this kind of bass line, but it's very common in a lot of classical music. It's basically separating a chord. And it just goes back and forth between those 4 notes in that kind of pattern. And so he does that to kind of establish it in the classical era, and then gives it a beautiful melody, which Patrick Doyle does a lovely job. But he's also imitating Mozart, who is famous for his beautiful melodies. So he's setting you in the world of classical era. The Regency era doesn't fit super well in a classical genre. It's the end of a classical era and the beginning of the Romantic era. So you have most composers will set it more in the classical era, which is slightly earlier, to kind of help set that tone. And they often use the famous three: Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. Even though Jane Austen never played Beethoven, you'll never hear any Pleyel, which is her favorite composer, in any of the adaptations. They're using people that you are familiar with as an audience and helping to set you in that world. So Patrick Doyle is one of the few places who doesn't use Mozart, Beethoven, and Haydn, but he's still trying to imitate it. So we have in Jane Austen adaptations, you'll either have the real music, especially in dances or in songs, or you have people who are imitating it to set the stage. The only person who really doesn't is in the 99 Mansfield Park. So if you ever listen to Mary's harp solo, that is a whole thing in itself and is not trying to imitate that era at all with her harp music. That's the only one that really tries to go slightly modern, which fits that particular adaptation. Actually, they're definitely setting its own tone in that. The other thing to keep in mind with the dances is that the choice of music is also telling a story. So that is particularly important when you have your balls, and especially your main couple. So you want that everybody has a slightly different version of how you tell that story. Some people really want to point out that this is a unique moment, and so they will use different music, maybe music from the original soundtrack instead of music that was written, instead of original dance tunes. Or in the case of the 2005 Pride and Prejudice, they use an old tune by Henry Purcell and then decide to give it modern harmonies. So you're combining an old and a new to make it stand out more. Or you might have an orchestra flourish, so you know this is the big moment as they stare into each other's eyes. So you'll always notice that there's something different usually in that special dance. Again, there's always an exception, and the 1995 Pride and Prejudice is the exception. They just use a traditional tune. They don't add any instrumentation. They don't take away instrumentation. It just fits very much in the world, but that fits very much with the miniseries itself. Trying to see if I have. I'm going to play a teeny bit of, if I can find it, sorry. This is where I know exactly where it is on my Spotify list, but they don't do things in order in the music book, which is always fun. Yeah, I might have to skip that dance. I know I have the Purcell somewhere for the 2005, but unfortunately I can't find it at this particular moment. So I'll see, because I don't have sharing, so I can't actually share the music with you from the soundtrack. But I highly recommend listening to the 2005 dance, because you can hear solo violin as everybody's dancing. And then once Darcy and Elizabeth, once they stop talking, essentially, that's when other instruments come in, and that's when everybody else disappears. Joe Wright loves to do that in his dances. He really likes to make it unique. So they're using what instruments they're adding or subtracting to really tell you the story of what's happening in the dance. Other ways that music helps tell the story is often comparison between class or people's level of ability. So in Emma, especially the newest one, Emma plays this lovely song. She almost shows off a little bit. Look how good I am. Harriet says, oh, Jane Fairfax can't be as good as you. And then Jane Fairfax sits down and plays an amazing Mozart sonata, and then immediately tells you Oh my goodness, there's a huge level of difference in ability that you don't have to use words. You can immediately hear what's going on. This happens in the 95 Pride and Prejudice. We hear Mary poorly sing a beautiful song by Handel, but even the dogs don't like it outside. And yet there's still this aspect of, oh, let me try another one. And Mrs. Hurst jumps in and plays Mozart's Turkish March way too fast. It's faster than you hear any recording, but she's just really showing off what she can do, and also demonstrating that we must save this situation from the Bennets. So you have all these different levels. In the 2005 Pride and Prejudice, they actually use the main theme is actually from Dawn, is actually also used for Elizabeth when she plays on the piano at Lady Catherine de Bourgh's. And she plays it just super poorly, which I always have a little bit of a problem with, because Mr. Darcy is supposed to be a man of taste, and he says she plays quite well, and she wasn't playing quite well. So you know that there's rose-colored glasses involved, but maybe not that much. But there's still that idea of she can play it, but then she hears Georgiana play it later on when she's walking around in Pemberley, and Georgiana plays it beautifully. And so you can hear this level again of connection of this music theme going throughout. And it's also connecting her to home. This is a theme that often is played to represent home. And we'll get into that a little bit near the end. I want to just talk about one or two other things that makes Jane Austen adaptations unique. One is that we want to hear the dialogue. So there's actually a lot of silence. And I know that's not something we usually talk about. We usually talk about what happens with the music. But the fact is that, especially in Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice and Persuasion, there's actually very little music comparatively to the length of the film. Yes, we notice the music, but there's actually a lot of silence. And a lot of that is so that we can hear Jane's words, or things that are very similar to Jane's words, which means then that the music is crucial for a couple things. One is a lot of transitions. I'm going to this home. I'm traveling to Devonshire. We're going to Pemberley. You know, those are the moments where you have the music, and it also will tell you either the emotional state of the characters as they're walking or arriving, or it's telling you about the place. Rosings. If you're going to Rosings, you hear that intimidating music for Lady Catherine de Bourgh, which I'll play in a little bit. But you also have a very different style of music for Pemberley. So you have very different music for different places and different people. Usually if there's a letter, there's a music accompanying a letter. So I don't know, but there's something maybe about voiceovers that you feel like you have to have music with, but there is something connected with that. And then of course you will have your romantic moment at the end, your proposal, your kiss. The one exception is 95 Persuasion, where they decide to have a circus instead. So I guess technically there's music, but I don't feel like that one counts because that's distracting personally. But everything else, usually you have your big moment, and then you have your title music. Your title music usually tells you already what kind of story this is going to be. Emma is going to sound very different from Northanger Abbey. So even though we may have a similar style for all your particular Jane Austen stories, they're going to sound different. Northanger Abbey is going to go Gothic, full Gothic, voice, bells. If you're going for 80s, the 80s one goes super 80s. There's definitely different versions of Gothic over time, but that's the version that often happens with Northanger Abbey. Emma is a comedy. So even though you may have three, if you look at the Gwyneth Paltrow Emma, that one's more of a romantic comedy. The miniseries is a little darker, but it's still fun and uplifting. And the title themes, it uses bells, which is very much of a wedding theme. You're going for wedding bells and different things like that. The newest one, it's just comedy, and it goes for it all the way. And actually, I find that music is super witty and funny in a way that many of the other ones aren't, just because it choreographs the motions with the music. And each person gets their own theme. So you get a lot of information about every single person by the instrument and the theme that is being used. So that one is especially fun. Mansfield Park is darker. It's a darker story, so you're going to get a darker feel. So each one will have its own unique style, even if there's certain kind of rules or not with your adaptations. With that in mind, I do want to talk a little bit about instrumentation before I do a little bit more just focusing on Pride and Prejudice. And that is that almost all of them will involve a piano or a harp. And in fact, most of them have both. And that makes sense if you know your Austen stories, right? Because there's somebody either playing a piano or a harp. So it fits very much within that particular world. The piano that they had is not the large piano that we have here. So it was short at least by an octave or two. And it was not as loud because it didn't have the steel underpinning to help raise out the sound. So we can make different dynamics, which you couldn't with the harpsichord, but it definitely does not have the power. And it's also harder to keep in tune, which is one of the reasons actually that it's not used in a ton of adaptations. It's not as familiar to your modern audience, but it's harder to keep in tune, and it's harder to mic and manage with lots of different instruments. And so there's only two that really decide to use the forte piano, and then all the other ones use modern pianos. And that, even though I know some people get bothered by what they see is not what they hear, the majority of your audience is not going to know the difference, or they're not going to pay attention to it. So I know there's a few people who are disappointed in Sun Sensibility. They're like, it's a small spinet and I'm hearing a large piano. But sometimes we just have to go, I know I have to just let that go a little bit. It's also harder to find a pianist who knows how to play the pianoforte. There is also that aspect of needing a specialist. The two that use it is the newest Emma, and that's only when you actually hear the characters perform. So when you hear Jane specifically, and then also Emma, that's when you have the pianoforte. The composer, Isabel Waller-Bridge, did consider using it for the entire piece, and then just realized, again, tuning was an issue. And then also just, it didn't match the mood of everything else that was happening. The one that is very specific is the 95 Pride and Prejudice. And that is completely forte piano all the way through. I don't know if any of you have the CD from the 90s of that particular one. It's unfortunately not available anymore, which just makes me really sad. So, but they actually would do recaps of every episode on the forte piano, because he had such a fantastic performer by Melville and Tan that he decided to use that, which is beautiful. But I also, part of me wanted more music from the, miniseries and less of a recap. But that's what they decided to do on the soundtrack. But it has a happier sound. The other thing with the 95, as we go towards that, is that Carl Davis, the composer, was very specific in wanting to imitate Beethoven, and specifically a Beethoven septet. This is a instrumentation of 4 strings, clarinet, bassoon, and French horn. I highly recommend listening to this piece because you can, if you start listening to it, especially the scherzo, you can hear Pride and Prejudice, the sound of Pride and Prejudice that we're used to. And so you can, and he'll admit in many of his interviews that that's what he was imitating. So I'm not just pulling that out of thin air. He admits that that's what he was looking for. And he cares very much about imitating both the style, but also the size. So they had a chamber ensemble for your smaller places, such as the Bennett household and Meryton. And then you would have a slightly larger ensemble of 15 or 18 people for Netherfield and Pemberley and stuff like that. But it's still a chamber ensemble, and that actually helps lend itself very much to that era in a way, between that and the forte piano, that the other ones don't. The other ones will have a full string section. You always have strings, almost always have piano, almost always have harp. And then you'll have a few solo instruments, flute, clarinet, a lot of clarinet. Clarinet was first used a lot in Mozart. So it's a way of just kind of getting used to bringing that Mozart connection in by a lot of solo clarinet. The occasional bassoon, like Mr. Collins, little buffoonery there, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you want to look at it. And a lot of French horn. French horn, for two reasons, and we're going to get into this a teeny bit with Pride and Prejudice. I can't quite play it the same way because I'm not a French horn player, but it's the idea of either nobility, so you hear it with a lot of your heroes, your Jane Austen heroes, status, but we're not quite royalty. So we're not going full trumpets. You actually don't hear trumpets a lot unless it's very specific occasions. But it also, at the beginning of the 95 Pride and Prejudice, it's also the idea of a hunting call. So they're hunting for husbands. So whenever you hear this theme, it's usually connected with the Bennet household. And they're hunting for husbands in good or bad ways, depending on how you like it. It's very subtle at the beginning. It's actually originally in the violins. I might have to do this with my cello because it's harder to do it on piano. So we're going to see how this goes. French horns can do a whoop that goes up like this, like a swoop. It's a lot harder to do on other instruments. So it's almost like, and that's that kind of hunting call sound. So you might even go farther. So you hear that right at the beginning of the part that you actually hear this the clearest is actually when Mr. Bingley is arriving to finally propose at the end. And then you really hear it in the French horns, like the moment has come to hear that hunting call, which is then carried throughout, but that's very unique to that particular. So usually when you start just on the piano, it just starts. But if you hear the French horn, it has that, which is a lot of fun. One of the things that makes the Pride and Prejudice theme fit very much with Elizabeth Bennet and the family in many ways is that it has a liveliness to it, in that it's a 6/8 tune. So 6/8 has definitely, it's almost like a jig, which is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's this movement that happens a lot more in keeping that kind of liveliness. And a lot of it makes sense. They're very particular with that adaptation of everybody's moving, right? You have the horses running across the field and Elizabeth is skipping down the lane. And there's definitely a lot more movement, especially compared to maybe some of your older 80s adaptations where things are a little bit more stage production. So they're already kind of setting the mood that this adaptation is going to be a little different. So I'm going to do this part on the piano because this one's easier on the piano than the cello. It keeps repeating that of that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3. And that is your major theme. Now, one thing that happens throughout is that it will change a little bit depending on the situation. It's actually used, interestingly enough, with Lydia and her letter about how she's running off with Wickham and everything. And so one of those is actually happy, but it's surrounded by minor chords on either side. So the family and the audience know this is not a good situation. And then there's one time where it's a little bit more on the minor side, which again is showing this is not a great situation. Then following that, we have in the opening theme, because it's already telling you two things. You have your hunting for husbands, and then you have your love theme, essentially. So we're gonna move that. Team Bigot. And then it kind of continues on to different instruments. And this is the theme of love, but it's not, part of it is just love in general. It's Elizabeth and her love with her sister. It's actually used also for in one or two moments with Charlotte as well. So it's love with her friend. And then later turns into more of a romantic theme with Mr. Darcy. When it's used in many of those contexts, what they do is they make it twice as slow. So that makes it much more intimate and a little bit like da, 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 dum. And it goes more like. And I think a lot of us immediately associate that with, oh yes, they're at Pemberley, they're about to run into each other. Mr. Darcy's coming in the white shirt and she's walking around and they don't know they're going to run into each other. Or it's in Clarinet as she's going to visit Charlotte. And then at the very end, they use both themes for the double wedding, which makes sense. They've won the husbands, but you also have the lovely romantic theme, which is in the flute. That's more of your higher, more romantic instrument. So the choice of instruments are usually very particular in what kind of mood you want to set, which is just lovely. So that slower one is a much more internal story. This is more reflecting of what Elizabeth's emotions are as it goes throughout the story. The one of the opening theme is less internal. It's more, a little bit more bubbly. Things are happening along the way. They do have another love theme, Elizabeth and Darcy, but a lot of it's just arpeggios, actually. I don't know if I have that one in this particular version. Don't think I do, unfortunately. But that one's, again, it has more space for people to actually talk, or just to kind of, they're not sure of their emotions as they have more interactions. I want to also talk one brief moment about one thing that this particular Pride and Prejudice does is that some characters have themes. Elizabeth's themes change. They have different tempos. They have major, they have minor, because it's reflecting her emotional journey. And then other people, their themes don't change at all. One, which I already mentioned before, we have. So it sounds different on cello than it does on bassoon, but that is Mr. Collins' theme. That one rarely changes at all. And then the other one that just never changes is Lady Catherine de Bourgh. So Lady Catherine de Bourgh, they are imitating what is called a French Baroque overture. And there's at least 3 adaptations, 3 or 4 actually, that will sometimes imitate your Baroque style or use a harpsichord. And usually those are for your characters who are rich and old and stuck in their ways. So they're musically telling you about these characters. Lady Catherine de Bourgh's is the most intimidating. It's in minor. There's lots of frills and trills and stuff like that, which I'm going to play. And also the French overture is like a 1, 2, da-da-dum, da-da-dum. So that's always your opening overture to like whatever opera you're playing or something like that. I think it's also used for Lady Danbury in Sanditon. And then also a little bit, there's a harpsichord used for Mr. Woodhouse in the newest Emma. So a little bit more lighthearted, but it's still using that harpsichord sound. And they actually do that, I think, actually in Bridgerton a little bit as well. Not quite as noticeable, but those 3 particular ones, it's used a little bit. But we're going to do a little bit of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. So it's always in minor. She's supposed to be intimidating. Her journey does not change, so her music doesn't change. So that's always a different way of telling the story with music. In contrast, we have the newer Pride and Prejudice. Well, I guess it's not newer anymore. The one from 2005, I guess it technically is newer, where he decides to imitate a little bit of Beethoven. And if you listen to some of Beethoven's early sonatas, so you can actually hear some of it. But unlike many of the other people like Sense and Sensibility with Patrick Doyle or this Pride and Prejudice, there's something in the classical era which is very particular about having clear rhythmic structure and clear harmonic structure. Everything had to be just super clear. You had rules and you needed to follow them. And I think that's one of the reasons they also like to follow that style for Jane Austen, because there is something about propriety and rules and stuff like that, that they really want to kind of have that in your music as well. But what happens is he uses the idea of the theme sounding a little bit like that, or your harmonies, but his rhythm doesn't match that at all. And when you have such a fantastic performer as Jean Austen, you don't notice in some ways how much they're starting to mess with time. But how they mess with time actually is a great way of telling Elizabeth's story. Now, it's a shorter story. You're going 2 hours instead of 6 hours. So you're not going to have a lot of themes in the way that you do. You don't have a specific one for Mr. Collins or Lady Catherine de Bourgh. It means that there's basically two main themes that get carried through, and then you might have one or two that get used a little bit. The solo piano is really essential for telling the story. And one thing that happens a lot with her opening themes is that they often will start with one repeated note and then start to just gain momentum. So that actually happens with a couple of the themes. And then the other thing that's really stands out is that the whole opening sequence of Dawn is just solo piano. So we don't have any other instruments. I think the other one that may be solo piano is Persuasion. There's a lot of solo piano in that one as well. But it definitely has a flow. Now, I'm not as good, obviously, as one of the best pianists in the world. So you'll be able to tell right away. But one of the things that you make it unique is that you have essentially, it's also in 6/8, but it's actually super slow. So instead of that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's a lot slower. But the right hand is in 2 and the right hand is in 3. And that you don't usually see very much yet at that point. Brahms later, like 50 years later, absolutely, but not yet at that period. So he's already starting to mess a little bit with what is the classical way, because he doesn't care as much about that. He cares much more about the emotional journey of what he's saying. And then what he does is he actually tells the same story, but then he does it twice as fast. So he's moving a lot more. So earlier it was like, and all of a sudden, so there's a lot of more motion, but he's still telling the same music. It's just a lot faster. And that's as you're introduced to the Bennett family. There's a lot more motion. The girls are running around. You see the animals. There's like just a lot. You hear Mary playing her scales. There's a lot more motion, and that's all told in the piano, but it's still ultimately the same music. I believe I heard in a commentary with Joe Wright that this was the music of home. And that's why Elizabeth places at Lady Catherine de Bourgh's home, and that's why she connects it with home when she hears Georgiana playing. It's very much the beginning, and then it's sort of the end. I love bookends. I think most good stories in movies should have bookends with your music. You should have something that connects it at the beginning, that connects at the end, and then you'll have the theme throughout as the story changes. The tricky part with this particular movie is that you had two different endings depending on whether you were in the UK or whether you're in the United States. So if you were in the UK, this was the ending music, because this is the music that plays as Mr. Bennett gives his permission, or his blessing rather, to Elizabeth, and says, if Mary and Kitty, there's anybody for them, I'm quite at my leisure. So you're still at the Bennet family home. It's connecting you to that particular moment. And it is also used in the main titles, which are at the end of this movie, because at this point, titles have moved from the beginning to the end in those 10 years. What's interesting, though, is that there is another theme that is more of Elizabeth's specific journey. And that is actually probably, if you're used to listening to the soundtrack, is most clearly heard in The Secret Life of Daydreams, but actually appears in several different points. And that is kind of the theme that portrays her emotional journey. This one is much more about the internal journey of Elizabeth than the miniseries. You'll notice that she's like thinking about things a lot more. And so the music is reflecting kind of where she is emotionally with those different moments. While it does happen a couple times previously, the one that we start to notice the most is the Secret Life of Daydreams. There's something called an ostinato, which cellists all know because Pachelbel's Canon in D is an ostinato. It's the same thing over and over and over again. So you're playing 8 notes. And you play it until the bride's finished walking down the aisle. And then that's about, you just get to know it really, really well. And in the same way, The Secret of Life, Life of Daydreams, as soon as the melody starts, it's the same thing. But we're not focused on that because we're actually focused on the melody, but the melody does not match up time-wise. So as she is thinking, she's circling around, she's thinking about Charlotte marrying Mr. Collins. Jane is disappointed with Mr. Bingley. She's just kind of trying to wrestle with what in the world is happening. So the music does not line up because there's a lot more dissonance because she can't make sense quite of what's happening. And that is your main theme that you will hear throughout a good chunk of this film. So I'm going to actually attempt daily Secret Life of Daydreams. There's just lots of pauses and stops, and then it starts, but it doesn't start on the downbeat, which is what you're supposed to do with a melody. It starts on the and. There's a lot of ands. I'm just not entirely sure what's going on. And that reflects a good chunk of her different melodies. This melody is actually played really fast. Right before they go to the Netherfield Ball, there's a joy and a emotion. So you're doing a completely different feel. And then that melody is then played in probably our 2 favorite spots, which is she stands on the cliff and, you know, you just hear all the strings. The piano's playing something completely different, but the violins play that theme. And it gives us when you have high violins, it gives a sense of soaring. So you're either flying or you're in love, usually when you have the high violins playing something like that, or maybe both if you're in Superman. But you're just usually having those kind of combinations together. And then this also plays right at the moment where Mr. Darcy's walking along the field in the mist, and you hear the harp glissando, because that's also super romantic. So you're going to have that happen. And then the violins play that as Mr. Darcy's walking along the field. And then you have it again in that Mrs. Darcy scene at the end, which is again, a kind of our bookend version for the Americans. So it's not completely at the very beginning, but that is the story musically that is connected throughout. And so you have lots of different versions of it. But then it becomes much more intimate and romantic because they actually don't have the piano, which is interesting. The piano is very much used throughout Elizabeth's journey, but they actually just use strings, and it's slower, and it just gives a sense of more romance at the end that the piano does not have. So that gives you a little sense. I wish I could play even more of that, but I think I've probably gone past the time I'm probably supposed to talk. I don't remember how long I was supposed to talk to. I could always talk more. But that hopefully gives you a little bit of sense of how you can use different themes throughout. The instruments are important in how things are told. As a cellist, I'm super excited that actually there's some beautiful cello moments for the heroes. So there's some beautiful moments in this Pride and Prejudice, mostly when she gets the letter, and that's really when Mr. Darcy's voice comes through. And so it's often used a little bit for Mr. Darcy, and the 2009 miniseries of Emma has amazing cello solo for Mr. Knightley as he's walking, which actually sounds very similar to Bach. But yeah, I might be slightly biased, but I think there's a lot of beautiful cello stuff. So I'm sorry I didn't actually play more cello things for you. Next time I'll have much more great preparation, because I would love to do actually a soundtrack, just maybe not in 2 days, of cello performance. But I'd really like the idea, so I'll have to play around with that a little bit. So I do see a lot of questions. All on. Okay, someone asked if the Jane's favorite composer is Pleyel. I did know stuff about him, and my brain has completely just gone blank about Pleyel. I think he was French. No, his name reflected something different than where he was actually from. I do remember that. And he played a lot of piano. There's a lot of composers that actually we don't hear much about, that are in Jane's notebooks. So it's a lot of fun. The only song that is used from Jane Austen's notebooks is Wally Wally, which is a tune, just a folk tune that is used in a choral version in the newest Emma. And actually, I believe is in the first season of Sanditon, but it's not in the soundtrack. She did have a little bit of Haydn. She did have a little bit of Mozart, no Beethoven. So Beethoven was hard. And not given out to all your normal everyday person. And he was very much a contemporary age-wise also with Jane Austen. So sometimes it's a matter of music getting to different places. So even though we hear Anne Elliot playing the Moonlight Sonata, the likelihood of Anne Elliot actually getting the Moonlight Sonata is probably pretty small, but that does happen a little bit. Thank you for, yes, he's French. Yes. Okay. I was glad he was French. Austrian born. Yeah, I think that's a tricky part with a lot of the composers. Where they are born and where they ended up was often a different place. Handel's a great example. He wrote a lot of his music in England. So that's why we use actually a lot of his music, his songs, in some of the adaptations, but he's originally from Germany. So, so we do have a lot of where they were born and then where they ended up. It's a little different. Yeah. Pleyel. I don't know why Pleyel is not in any of the soundtracks. I honestly think it's mostly just because they're using people that you're familiar with. So Mozart, one day somebody will use Pleyel. I don't know why they haven't yet. Even Love and Friendship, which branches out past your normal big three. They also use Vivaldi, and it's slightly earlier, so they use a lot more Baroque composers. They use a mixture of older, well-known composers and famous ones, but they still don't use. You still don't use Pleyel. It's a part of it is also if you're using classical music, you want a specific drama, and there's a specific dramatic component that every time they use a specific piece. And I think with piano pieces, because that's usually what you're using him, since he's a pianist, you're you're very limited, I think, in what you're choosing. So, did Caitlin, yeah, Kate Winslet did actually sing her songs. They are not on the soundtrack. That's always fascinating thing when you're listening to the soundtracks, because he does use the songs, but he's just a lovely opera singer instead. So, and that again is bookends actually the soundtrack. I used to have it on a cassette tape, so it was always interesting. Just go, okay, the beginning, I know exactly which side we're on, because they either started with the opera singer or ended up with the opera singer. That just always, but yes, I believe she did actually sing. Half the time they sing them and half the time they don't. Actually, I'd say most of the singing is done by the actors and actresses. A lot of the playing is not. They will practice it, but the majority of the time you're not actually hearing the actors or actresses. The lady who played Jane Fairfax in the newest Emma, she actually recorded and performed all those fancy Mozart sonatas. So she was actually a very gifted performer. But yeah, the majority of them, they practice, but you still won't get to hear them. So that is also something. Yes, so specific considerations about adapting Austen. A lot of it does because you do have a lot more balls. So there is definitely the balls and then the performances. So whether it is Mary playing the harp or Jane Fairfax and Emma performing, I think you just kind of see that as part of your plot, as opposed to just kind of in the background, as opposed to a lot of adaptations. Also, when I'm watching a Gaskell, there's less performances in Gaskell. It's not part of her story, right? You don't have any of the characters really doing that as much. Same thing with Dickens. So a lot of it just has to do with her specific kind of stories, that it's just part of the narrative. And so that is why I think that is very specific to Jane Austen adaptations in particular. Even Bronte, there's not as much performance. And they care more, I think, about having music that fits sort of with that world. That I think is something that's unique. And also giving the space, which is something that I think other ones don't care quite so much about, and setting the tone for that. Okay, so I will admit, I need to watch the 1980 version because I haven't seen that since I was a teenager. So I was not paying attention to the music when I was watching that as a teenager. So I do need to watch that again because several people have brought that up. I know people love that one a lot. I think there's a very specific sound to the majority of the late 70s, early 80s BBC adaptations, that you listen to it and you go, yes, that is BBC from this era. And so, I don't know, they love the English and the BBC adaptations do love kind of their single wind instruments. And also there's a budget consideration, unfortunately, that sometimes will happen. So you will often have a smaller, either you'll have your strings, maybe your piano and your few winds, but you're not going to go full orchestral often. But it has been a little while since I have seen that. So I need to remedy that. The only one I have seen recently is the Northanger Abbey one in the 80s. And that's a whole nother thing. So that doesn't really fit in any of the other music genres at all. But yes, I do need to watch that again so I can give a more informed opinion, because that's the only one I haven't seen more recently. I've seen the 40s. The 40s one is very much old Hollywood sound of 40s music, which is lovely. But yeah, it's been a little while since I've seen that. The Bridgerton soundtrack. Yeah, both. I love that the sound, the question is whether what I think of the contemporary pop songs arranged as if they're classical music. I like that it's almost all string music. And I love whoever arranged their music is fantastic, whether it's the composer, Chris Bowers, or their three orchestrators. They know how to write for strings. And I will say it's actually hard to adapt pop songs or things that sound like pop for strings that sound really good. So they've done an excellent job with that. And it actually keeps the tone consistent throughout the whole the whole series. And I also like that. In some ways, I don't always appreciate kind of being brought out of it and then being brought back in. So but it's also connecting your current audience who knows these songs and going, oh yes, I love the song. I know what the words are. And then that gives it extra meaning. Unfortunately for me, I am a classical musician and I know almost none of these songs. And so for me, it has almost no meaning. And I will say that some of the songs, as well as they arrange it, pop songs don't always have the best melodies, and they need their words. And so some of them I think work better than others. I think they could have done similar genre or write things in that similar way. But some of them actually, to me, sound a little boring or a little off-putting, just because I don't know the songs. I think they did much better in the second season than they did the first season. I think they really found their groove and what works. But yeah, I'm kind of mixed on whether I like it or not, just because I don't know what I have to look up what the words are instead of just being like, oh yes, this song means something to me, except for Wrecking Ball. And that really threw me off. So that's the way it goes. Yeah. They did actually, I did look it up. They did actually use Alanis Morissette. So they did use, and a Material Girl, that's the other one I did recognize a little bit of. But yeah, you definitely, for some people, they're like, yes, I love this song. It brings them back and that's great. But yeah, for those of us who don't know that, but I think that's why they want to do it. They want to connect people and bring them in. So it's not your, what they call your normal period drama, because it's not a normal period drama. They're doing something very different, but it works for their, yeah, exactly. They're very much aggressively not doing it. But it does, it works for what they're doing. And I think what's nice is that once you've gotten used to this first season, then you go, okay, this is what they're doing. And so you kind of accept it more in the second season, where the first season, you just go, what in the world is happening? I will also say, because I've been analyzing the music for the second season, because I think it's really good, that if you notice when the songs are not important, it's actually classical music in the background. So they actually are using some classical music in their ballroom. It's just, they want to use specific songs when it's important. Or they're trying to say something. So anytime your main couple is dancing, you're going to have a song that has words. And then if when the Duke is dancing with the youngest sister for the first time, the music is just classical music. It doesn't matter as much. So they are actually saying things with their music, and that's true for a lot of these. Your dances, they really highlight. I don't even know if this is a little outside of Jane Austen, but the newest War and Peace, for better or for worse, it's got some great things. But in the music, they have this beautiful waltz. They're doing a normal waltz, and then halfway through, they stare at each other's eyes, and the music completely changes. So I think a lot of the time, it's kind of like that romantic theme that kind of just switches halfway through. But a lot of different dances, it's that key dance that that composers or directors really want to kind of highlight. And most of the Jane Austen ones are like that. So gotta highlight those important dances. If I missed anybody, or did I get everybody? I think I got all the questions. I know I went through things fast. I have a tendency to do that because I have a lot of information. And my then podcast that I just released in March is an hour on 1995 Pride and Prejudice. So there's where you just go. It's really hard for me to sometimes bring it down to 15 minutes when you just go, I can talk about this for an hour. But that's a lot of fun. Which is my favorite one? People have asked that a lot. I have a hard time choosing a favorite. I think it's a mixture. So if I'm just listening to beautiful music, I love the 2005 Pride and Prejudice. There is a calmness to it, which I just love. There's an absolute beauty to it. With some soundtracks, you can just listen to it and almost not even think of necessarily the story, and you can just enjoy the music. And I think there's definitely ones where I've enjoyed the music and never even seen the movie. So there's definitely things that just kind of transcend a little bit. Sense and Sensibility by Patrick Doyle was the second album I ever bought. And so that is always going to have a very special place in my heart, because it's just delightful. It's one of those things, you start listening to it and just makes me happy. So, and then I will also say the newest Emma, actually, I think it's very witty and very funny. And they tell the story beautifully through the music. There's a lot more music than most of your adaptations. They care less for your silence. But that's the story that they're telling. So even though it may not be my favorite like version of Emma that matches the book, music wise, I think it's like Jane Austen in music. I think it's just really funny. So that's my newest favorite. I listen to a lot. So yeah, those are probably my favorites. It's always fun to hear what everybody else's favorites are too, because I know that changes for a lot of people. So yeah. The song that Anne Elliot plays in Captain Wentworth. I don't know if I do know that one. The interesting thing with a lot of some of the adaptations will give you a list. They're doing better at it with movies. Well, they'll tell you every single song that's in a movie. A lot of the BBC things don't tell you anything. So especially if it's been on the aired on BBC and then Masterpiece, they don't tell you any of the songs, who things are by. So I do have a list of things that I've looked at. Let me see if I have that one for Persuasion. I'm assuming you're talking about the 95 Persuasion. I don't think I do. I can hear it in my head, but no, I don't know what tune. I'm assuming it's a naval tune, or at least they're imitating a naval tune, whether it actually was or not. Yeah. Oh, now Clueless is another one I haven't listened to a long time. That's all. That fits the pop. Definitely, it has to match the 90s Hollywood, of that era. So that makes sense. You're fitting your world. You're setting your world with whatever kind of music you're going to. So if you're in California in the 90s, then you've got to use music that fits California in the 90s. And that's why you're going to have more orchestral music or piano music with Jane Austen. So yeah, you're not going to expect to have kind of your, let's set a Jane Austen film in Hollywood. It doesn't quite work. You got to know your setting to really make it match with all the outfits and dialogue. Yeah, that one's fits in the romantic comedy era, 90s especially. That was the peak of romantic comedies. Prada Donata. I haven't seen that one in a while either. Yeah, same idea. Any modern adaptation, you're going to probably have pop music because it fits the era. Except for the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, which doesn't have any music except for your opening theme, which is fantastic. But yeah. Did I miss any other questions at all?
I think that was all the questions we had in the chat. Does anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, I like paying attention to the music. And I really like that people will pay more attention to music after listening to my talks. Because it's more fun to just go, oh, because most people aren't paying attention to it. Other people care about the characters or how the dialogue or the costumes, or there's so many different things everybody has their eyes kind of catch. And as a musician, my ears will latch onto things. Sometimes the second time, if it's really good, I'll hear it the first time. Because I still do with Jane Austen stories, I do very much care what you're doing to my story. And then I'll pay more attention to what you're doing with the music. But yeah.
So I'm just going to talk because I'm tired of typing, but I mean, I'm not a musical person at all, but first of all, when you played some of those things, like it immediately summoned up the moments in the movie for me. So obviously I must have absorbed something. I mean, I think that there's a way in which the music conveys something to you almost subliminally, even if you don't know anything about music, right?
Yes. Yeah, it's guiding you, it's telling you the story most of the time, and it's also guiding your emotions. There's only two that just don't have themes that carry through. The Persuasion 95 doesn't have, it's using mostly classical music, and Love and Friendship, which is also the two that use mostly classical music. Everything else will have a theme or two themes that will carry through. And then if you watch it over and over and over again, you just don't even know, especially the miniseries. If you're watching that opening title thing happens every single time. So then it really gets in your ear because you just hear it, dum, ba-da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum, and you just see the pink, fabric, and you're just already, I'm here in Pride and Prejudice. So yeah, the themes we do, they actually, the more they repeat, the more you'll remember them, even if you're not consciously thinking, oh, I love this specific theme. Which is, it is great to just realize, oh, this version of storytelling is actually something I have internalized, even if I haven't done it on purpose.
You seem like you're also a big fan of, the books as well. I mean, I assume since, you've kind of like made this a subspecialty. And it seems just like there's kind of like a delicate balance between, I mean, on one hand, you want to stay true to the story and stay true to the period. But on the other hand, I mean, you want to communicate in a very sort of immediate and, auditorially interesting way, to people who might not be like classical musicians and stuff like that. And do you think that most, do you think that most of the adaptations you've discussed have struck that balance? And do you think that any adaptations maybe went too far, either in, being too modern, or went too far maybe in trying to, sort of be slavishly, period accurate, and, didn't have kind of like the lightness and the liveliness and the narrative power that some of the other adaptations had?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is often the vision of the director. So we like to say that a lot of it is due to the composer, but the composer is really following the director's vision. So I do think that the two Pride and Prejudices really capture the vision of what those particular adaptations are saying. They're very different adaptations, but the music really matches what each one is saying. I think that's true for the two Sense and Sensibilities as well. I think they both are very different. The miniseries, I will say, I know the electric guitar kind of catches people off guard when Colonel Brandon is coming to the rescue, but it says something, and it's very subtle. It's not too bad. Martin Phipps loves his little bit of electronics. But he is somebody who cares very much about your emotional journey, and he doesn't care at all about sounding period accurate. And I think those who hire him are very specific about that. So he's actually done North and South, and the Sense and Sensibility miniseries, and the newer Persuasion. And the newest Persuasion, it has almost a minimalist sound to it. There's actually just kind of a repetition, and it's a very popular kind of music style that's happening more and more in music right now, in both in films, less melodic, but it's setting a mood. And he cares much more about setting a mood. So I think in some ways that's nice and fits kind of Anne's internal monologue in many ways. And I guess that's, but it's also, there's not much more than that. Like, there's a reason I think there's not a soundtrack for that one, because you're playing a lot of same stuff over and over again. So you don't have as much to offer as far as difficulties. I think there's two for me that kind of stand out, two or three that I'm not crazy about. The 2007 Mansfield Park with Billy Piper.
Yeah.
There's nothing remarkable in the music. So it's kind of just blah. There's nothing, it just kind of almost doesn't, the 99 takes some risks, and whether I agree with the risks or not, some of it, it's one that I love, certain tracks I love, but I don't want to listen to the whole album because it's very random. And you're doing lots of different, it's a little too modern in some ways for me, just orally, than is more common for most soundtracks in general, actually. So I think there's a lot of really cool things, but when you have something that just doesn't stand out to you at all, good or bad, I think to me that means that it's just not as good. So that to me, I'd rather have something that just either aggravates me or really speaks out to me. And that Mansfield Park does nothing for me. I will admit I do not like saxophone. And the 80s Northanger Abbey uses saxophone for its hero because that's what you did in the 80s and the 90s. And so that personally is a little too modern. I can get past a lot of the other 80s synthesizers and things like that, but the saxophone just really bothers me. And then I love Persuasion, and I love the 95 Persuasion. I want a soundtrack that I really like. I actually find the classical music they chose if they're going to use classical music, I'd rather use it that fits the period. And they used Chopin, who's a little later, and they used Bach, who was out of favor at that time. And they're both super slow versions. They're beautiful pieces, and I highly recommend listening to other versions of them because I feel like they kind of stripped a little bit of the life out of them, unfortunately. So as much as I love that Persuasion, and I'm so used to how it fits together, but that particular one, I wanted a little bit more drama than it gave me. I think they could have elevated it a little bit more, just to help you emotionally feel a couple more things in a couple areas than it actually did. And I understand why they chose not to. It's just not my personal preference. So, but I don't know if that's also because it was originally meant for the small screen, and then all of a sudden last minute we kind of like, here we're going for the big screen. And if it would have been different if they kind of knew they were heading for that direction. But it could have just been that it matched the vision again of what the director was thinking. But for the most part, I think they've done a good job of balancing out story and moving your emotions. And most of them will give allusions to the time period, even if you're not fully staying in there. So they'll usually do that in the majority of them, which is nice, even if you don't have to stay in it as rigorously as they do in 1995 Pride and Prejudice. That's the only one that stays fully in that era. Yeah. That's a great question. All right. Do we have any more questions?
Well, if we don't have any more questions, I'd just like to thank everybody for coming today. And Ruth, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. As someone who is into music, I will have to focus a little bit more on the things you mentioned, like the like horns and all of that. I never noticed that before, but it was very nice. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Ruth, for your presentation. Just a repeat of what Jessica said, our next meeting is on North and South. We'll be discussing that next month. Thank you, everyone, and have a good afternoon.
Great. Thank you.